Hi, my name is ELusbyDonovan, and this is a presentation on a paper proposal that I wrote about behavioral momentum, resurgence, and exercise-related behaviors. So just to begin, I need to talk a little bit about basic research, applied research, and translational research, and the difference between all of those, because that is really relevant to the topic of behavioral momentum and resurgence. So just briefly, basic research is more focused around laboratory experimental research with really controlled environments and has been a huge part of the foundation of behavior analysis, and that is essentially where the principles that we use in applied settings were derived. And so looking at the applied research, this is taking those principles and using them to study human behavior in those applied settings. Now, the difference between basic and applied is pretty evident. However, translational research is pretty neat because it takes the findings from the laboratories, from the basic research, and in a very systematic and methodological way, studies issues that we find in applied settings. So in this paper, I'm going to dig in a little bit to the basic research of behavior momentum, some applied research, and then with resurgence as well, and then give a little background, give a little proposal as to how we can use that in a different area, and move forward with some research. So just some history on behavioral momentum. Behavioral momentum was proposed by Nevin and his colleagues in 1983, and it is essentially a metaphor that is used to describe a behavior's resistance to change in the presence of a disruptor. And so those disruptors, things that we commonly are refer to them as are extinction or satiation or distraction. In the basic literature too, pre-feeding, when we're looking at animal research is also a common one used too. So behavioral momentum theory is pretty neat because it's derived from the principles of Newton's second law of motion, so an object in motion stays in motion, and it involves the velocity and mass. So essentially, if you think about a balloon versus a bowling ball, and they're moving at the same speed in space, it's going to require much more force to stop a bowling ball than it would a balloon. And so we can apply that same metaphor, the same theory to behavior. So we start talking in terms of behavioral velocity and behavioral mass. So behavioral velocity indicates the rate of responding. In baseline, the rate at which an animal or human is responding, and then behavioral mass is the resistance to change that rate of responding occurs given a disruptor, like I said, such as extinction or distraction. So the rate of reinforcement is inversely related to reductions in responding during steady state baseline conditions, meaning that if a behavior gets more reinforcement in baseline, it is going to be more resistant to change. So a lot of research has been done in the basic literature as far as magnitude of the disruptor, as far as schedules of reinforcement. For instance, Nevin, he did a lot of research in this area. He's the big name in behavioral momentum theory. He looked at pigeons and studied their behavior given a two-component multiple schedule reinforcement system, and produced data indicating that the resistance of key pecking behavior is positively correlated with total number of reinforcers delivered during baseline. So again, the findings from behavioral momentum theory that is in line with that as well, and those have been replicated pretty consistently in the literature with non-humans, but also with humans in the basic literature. So Dube and McIvan, they examined individuals with severe cognitive impairments, and they were given 2 tasks, and the findings were the same in regard to resistance of change in those behaviors. That has also been replicated with individuals in sorting dinner software, and then undergraduate students with keyboard typing behavior too. So given that there's such an extensive base of data with the experimental literature, applied researchers have also utilized the data supporting this. And one of the biggest things to come out of that has been the high P sequence that most behavior analysts are pretty familiar with. And so that was first documented in the literature around 1988 when Mace and his colleagues utilized this high P sequence, so taking high probability demands to increase momentum towards low probability demands. So looking at decreasing non-compliant behaviors. With the theory in mind, using that theory from behavior momentum that if a behavior has more reinforcement, is contacting that reinforcement in baseline, that it's going to be more resistant to change. So resisting the change of compliant behavior, kind of just using that momentum forward. So that again has been utilized and examined in the literature a lot. The reinforcer quality has been examined. The effects of programmed and non-programmed reinforcement has been examined, and then also in a variety of different behaviors, including non-compliant behavior and food refusal behavior, just to name a few. And since this paper talks about translational research, it is important to note that this was more applied research. They did not take the systematic findings from the basic research and apply that to the high P sequence. So this is applied research, and so just wanted to make that differentiation between applied and translational. So moving into the topic of resurgence, and this is gets a little tricky because resurgence falls under the category of treatment relapse, which is really important when we're talking in applied settings about these behaviors that we have previously extinguished behaviors making a reappearance later on after they have been already extinguished. So simply defined, resurgence is the reappearance of a previously extinguished behavior when reinforced alternative responses for that behavior have been extinguished. And so this phenomenon was documented in 1983 when Epstein did some work with pigeons and discovered that during extinction of the response of the first key, a second key pecking behavior was reinforced and extinguished. And so when that occurred, they saw a resurgence of behavior of the first key peck. And so that is really applicable across a lot of applied settings, given that we do not want behaviors that have been extinguished to resurge in the future. So there is some evidence to the contrary, though, if we're thinking of resurgence and minimizing that through behavior momentum theory. There is some evidence to the contrary in the literature. And so several findings have indicated that the effects of resurgence can be minimized, like I said, through behavior momentum theory. However, those findings are unclear. And so in 2016, Craig and Shanahan examined the effects of reinforcement of alternative behaviors at different rates during extinction of target behaviors in rats. And so what they discovered was that alternative rates of reinforcement can lower the extinction process, the duration of that extinction process in different contexts. However, when low rates of alternative reinforcement were delivered, they noticed an increase in resistance. And so even digging in a little further, when the reinforcement for alternative behaviors were delivered frequently and then withheld, resurgence occurred reliably. and so just the different rates of reinforcement, it really kind of conflicts with what the data supporting behavior momentum theory is stating. So essentially saying behavior momentum theory saying, on this hand, we have high rates of reinforcement make a behavior resistant to extinction, but then looking at some of the data done, research done in the area of resurgence, saying that lower rates of alternative reinforcement make that behavior more resistant to extinction. So we've got some conflict going on there, which is pretty interesting. So moving forward, I think that those two areas would be really interesting to dig into a little bit in the area of exercise. And so according to, first of all, let me lay some groundwork. According to a recent report from the CDC, there are only 22.9% of U.S. adults are consistently achieving the recommended aerobic and muscle strengthening activities that are recommended by, like I said, the CDC. And so there are a lot of things that we can talk in behavioral terms when it comes to that. And there has been some research done about adherence to physical activity programs and what that looks like. But just speaking from a behavioral perspective, there are a wide range of competing contingencies that occur with exercise, especially if we do not find exercise that reinforcing. And so first we can talk about potential reinforcement history associated with exercise's incompatible behaviors that generally have a high rate of reinforcement in their history. And given behavior momentum theory, these behaviors have a history of dense reinforcement, which would make them highly resistant to change, given a disruptor such as extinction. And so in addition to a common problem when beginning a new exercise program, a lot of people think about getting over the hump, and it's really hard to get over the hump of, okay, first week or two, something like that, getting into a new routine or something of that nature. The getting over the hump is a pretty common phrase that I hear. So when we think in terms of that, it refers to a period where potential reinforcers associated with exercise have yet to govern that individual's exercise behaviors. And so taking into consideration behavior momentum theory, a behavior with lower rates of reinforcement and baseline would be less likely to persist in the presence of a disruptor, such as distraction or even previous pain or pain from previous workouts or something of that nature. So given, those two scenarios, it's possible to address exercise-related behaviors within a behavior momentum framework. But as discussed also in this paper, there's the issue with resurgence and the evidence that is a little contrary to that in the literature about reinforcement of alternative behaviors and potentially lower rates of reinforcement, making a behavior less likely to resurge in the future. So just taking into consideration the different findings in the literature, given the issues with exercise adherence programs, I think that would be a really interesting route to take future research, and looking at rates of reinforcement when beginning an exercise program on the future persistence of that behavior over time, and whether the incompatible behaviors with exercise tend to resurge given extinction. So thank you for your time, and I appreciate you watching this.